Of all the time to take a trip, Ralph and his wife are in Nebraska, and I hope it snows. You're on, Tom.
Thank you. My name's Tom Shive. Ralph got my schedule arranged and told me when I would give my war story. And I agreed. He gave me a little outline showing the points to cover. And so then he said, I won't be there that day. Well, that's a bad sign, but I'll do the best I can. I was born and raised in Iowa. My dad was
That's too bad.
yeah, my dad was an engineer on the Iowa State Highway Commission at a time when they were building concrete roads in Iowa and getting it up out of the mud. And he also had served in the Army Corps of Engineers in World War I. My mother was a school teacher and also did a lot of volunteer work for the Red Cross. One of my kids in recent years said, Dad, what was the first job you ever had? And I said, well, if I think back, really the first job was we had a 2 or 3 inch snow in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where we lived, and our next door neighbor, an elderly lady, called and said, could Tom come over and shovel my sidewalk and driveway? So I did that, and afterwards I rang the doorbell and said, I'm all finished. She gave me a nickel. That night it snowed again, and she called and said, Tom should come over again and shovel the driveway and the sidewalk. I did, went up to the door, rang the bell and said, I'm finished. He said, thank you very much. So that was my first job, and I learned a few lessons from that one.
Negotiate first.
Negotiate first, that's right. Well, growing up during the Depression, there weren't a lot of things for entertainment, but I was active at school, played football, and got involved in the Boy Scout program, and eventually managed to graduate from high school and signed up for a freshman year at Iowa State in 1941. Fall of 41, I started at Iowa State to study engineering. And all freshmen were expected, all men freshmen were expected to be enrolled in the ROTC program, and the program they had was the field artillery. Were any of you involved in field artillery or in any way? Okay. We had the assignment of learning as much as we could about the ways of field artillery, and also learning how to ride horses and how to care for horses. And the equipment we had was pretty old. It was World War I material, caissons and French 75 cannons on wheels. And we studied horse diseases and really got as far into it as we could. But on the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed, it sort of got our attention that we were working with World War I stuff, and suddenly we were on the brink of a new kind of war, and started examining whether we wanted to really be riding horses or what. That Sunday, we went to a movie, Sergeant York. And before the movie, there was a short film that Jimmy Stewart had made. Remember Jimmy Stewart? He was making this movie as a recruiting vehicle for the Army Air Corps. So there's Jimmy Stewart with a white scarf around his neck, leaning up against his AT-6 trainer, and lots of interesting noises and all. And when that movie was over, we went out and en masse, we went down to enroll in the Army Air Corps. Nothing wrong with the field artillery, but we thought by the time we either get out of school or get called to active duty, we didn't think we were going to be riding horses anymore. But in all fairness, the ROTC program was doing the best they could with what they had, and they didn't have very much to go on. We were called to active duty in about February of 1943. The Army Air Corps said that if you guys are students, if you stay in school and make your grades, we'll leave you in school as long as we can, and then when we need you, we'll call you to go to pre-flight school. And it turned out that pre-flight school was so crowded that they really didn't have a program to put you into until 43. The program that we went into was a pre-flight arrangement, where we went to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri to be taught how to drill and do all the basic things, and then we were sent to pre-flight at Milwaukee and taught to fly Piper Cubs and Taylor Cubs, and we thought that was great. Here we are all of a sudden learning how to fly, and we haven't even been to pre-flight school yet. But eventually, we were called to active duty and got on a train and rode out to Santa Ana and went through the pre-flight routine there.
What was that, what date were you out there in Santa Ana?
I would say May or June of 1943. And at the end of pre-flight, we were all assigned to go to our next cadet assignment. And at that time, they said everybody wants to be a pilot, which was true. But they said we need to have bombardiers and navigators also, and we're starting to lose quite a few air crews. And as a result, some of you are going to be assigned to be a bombardier or a navigator, even though you want to be a pilot. I was assigned to become a bombardier, and then after finishing bombardier school, maybe I could go to navigation school, but I couldn't see any way I was going to become a pilot, and that was okay. Before bombardier school, we were sent to aerial gunnery school in Kingman, Arizona, and learned how to operate the 50 caliber machine guns and assemble and disassemble and all these things. And then after checking out on the handheld 50 calibers, we were sent on air-to-air missions to shoot at these big sleeves that were towed, and everybody had a different color on the tips of the 50 caliber shells, so they could bring the sleeve in and say, well, red got so many hits and green got so many, so on. And during that time, our class was we managed to score our first kill on a plane. Somebody in our squadron shot down a tow plane. Right. They didn't ever tell us what color the holes were in the plane, but fortunately no one was killed. Well, that kind of sobered us up and made us realize that this was a real thing. After that, I did get started in navigation school, and about halfway through that, they said the Air Force has decided not to accept any more cadets into dual training. We need bombardiers, we need navigators, but we're going to take you, once you get one of these skills over the hill, we're going to take you and put you on a crew and send you to combat, because we need combat crews. Before before doing that, after the crew training, they said, we'll send you home for a couple of weeks and you can say goodbye to your family and get ready to get geared up and leave for combat. While I was home, my mother said, now you're going to go to combat, right? Yes. And you're going to Europe? Yes. Where? Well, we don't know yet. We won't find that out until after we take off and we'll open our orders. And she said, well, you've never been to Europe. How will you know where to go? Oh, Mother, you know, we'll have maps and we'll have radio and all these good instructions. She said, I'm going to worry about you. And I said, you'll worry anyway, but don't worry about that. We'll find out where we're going. So we went to Lincoln, Nebraska, picked up a brand new B-17, and our crew, flying together after our indoctrination period, started out, flew to Manchester, New Hampshire, Gander, Newfoundland, and then we were to take off and fly over the ocean to the Azores. And none of us had ever flown across an ocean before. So here we are, a brand new, inexperienced crew, starting off on the start of an odyssey. When we got to the Azores, the control tower said, we have bad weather here today, and you don't have any alternative. You can't land anywhere else. You have to land here. But look out for that very high hill just to the southeast end of the runway, because we've had several planes hit that already today. So it's an attention getter. And since we were making essentially a very low visibility landing, managed to do that safely, and thought, well, it's going to get more exciting than this, but here we go. Next stop was Marrakesh in North Africa, and then Tunis, and then we were given the exact location where we were to go, in Foggia, which was in the 15th Air Force, about halfway up in the boot that represents the shape of Italy. Foggia was our destination, and it turned out that around the city of Foggia there were 5 different landing fields. And when we got up to the one that we were supposed to find, we made the preparation and got into the traffic pattern and started landing, and the tower kept telling the pilot, I can't see you, where are you? And the pilot said, well, I'm on the final approach. Well, they still couldn't see us. Well, ended up we landed at the wrong landing field. Turned out my mother was right. Well, we got through that okay. The 99th Bomb Group had been very active in North Africa before going to Italy. They had flown, well, by the end of the war, they had flown 395 different combat missions. Combat mission being however many planes you sent on one day. That was one mission for the 99th. We started flying missions in August of '44. Targets like Black Hammer, Ploesti, Vienna, the Romanian oil fields, and we had pretty heavy flak and pretty heavy enemy fighters to contend with, and we on the average, I believe the 15th Air Force was losing 4% of their planes on every mission. So if you had a 1,000 plane mission, the average lost would be 40 aircraft and 40 crews. Not all the missions were over these tough targets. One day in mid-September of '44, the word came through that the German High Command had a high-level meeting in Athens, Greece. And I don't know how the information was picked up, but our mission was to scramble and get our planes ready and take off and fly to this airport and bomb the airport, try to burn up all of the planes that were parked on the ramps there. There were lots of planes. So we took off. It was a beautiful day. No weather problems. We went in at 26,000 feet. We could see the beautiful blue ocean and what looked like an image that was out of a movie. It was beautiful white rocks and white, all the buildings looked white. And I had some little feelings of guilt that I didn't want to mess up on this mission because Athens being such an interesting historical city, they had enough ruins already. I didn't want to generate more ruins. But we bombed the airport. We had a small formation, not too many of us, but we were using incendiary fragmentation bombs, and we really did a job on the planes parked in that area. My mission memory was turning away after dropping our bombs, and there was this huge plume of black smoke rising up from that airport. We were at 26,000 feet, and the smoke was going up higher than we were. And we felt like we had a really satisfactory mission. We got home and landed, and we didn't have a single bullet hole or a single black hole in our plane. That was a first. I think it was the first mission that we ever flew, and we didn't get at least some damage to the plane. But that was a milk run, and it was memorable. Just a few years ago, my wife and I were on a cruise of the Greek Isles, and when we went to Athens, I asked the tour guide if Athens had sustained any damage from the bombing during World War II. And the guide said, no, absolutely not. No damage, no problem. So my conscience was clear about Athens. In the fall of '44, the flying weather over Europe deteriorated as it normally does in the fall, November, late October, November. And it was impossible to fly formation missions because you couldn't find the other planes and it would be too dangerous. So they had developed what they called the lone wolf missions. And some of the planes, some of the B-17s were equipped with radar, and it was possible to take off and never see your target visually, only find it with the radar. And we did some practice missions, and it was pretty accurate. You could actually do a good enough job. You might not hit exactly on a target, but you'd be within a few yards or maybe 100 yards where you're dropping a string of bombs, and you could do a pretty good job of damaging the target area. So we flew a couple of daytime lone wolf missions, and then on the 25th of November, 1944, 60 years ago this next Thanksgiving, we were assigned a night lone wolf mission. Jeez. And we were to fly to Linz, Austria to bomb a refinery. And we took off at midnight, and from the time we took off, of course it was dark, and we didn't see anything on the ground, no lights, nothing. And we flew by radar for about 3 hours. So around 3 a.m., we were actually on the bomb run, and I was over the bomb site. I couldn't see anything, but the radar operator kept giving me angles to set into the bomb site, and we were on the bomb run the last 2 or 3 minutes before our bombs away, when something hit our plane, and we had been briefed that there were night fighters, ME-210s, that were active in this area, and we had a chance that they might find us with their radar. And at any rate, we were hit. The plane went over like this and down into a spiral, into a spin. Again, we were bombing from 26,000 feet. And I had never heard of a B-17 getting out of a spin. And so I thought, well, this is this may be the end. The things that flashed through your mind, my thoughts were, I'm 20 years old, and this is probably the end of my life. Well, fortunately, the damage we sustained was bad enough that the plane started to break up. And the nose section actually broke away, and the plane broke apart apparently in a couple of other places farther back. But when it broke up, I was thrown clear, and suddenly I was in this, still the black of night. I was wearing a chest pack, and those of you that are familiar with chest pack, you know that you carry it and it snaps onto a harness right here.
Right.
And if you need to use it, you pull the handle, and the ripcord goes out. The parachute opens. There are stitches on the harness that break away when the parachute opens. They break away, so you're hanging from a harness behind your back, and you take hold of the risers and go down. Well, in all the banging around that I had encountered in the nose of this plane before it broke up, the stitches had already become broken, and so the chest pack, instead of being here, was out here somewhere in the dark. I could find it, but I couldn't find the ripcord. It was all tangled up. And I didn't know how much more time I had, but I thought, it's do or die. So I managed to get hold of part of the casing on the chest pack and started pulling it out, and got hold of some silk, and I was pulling out silk when finally I came to the ripcord, pulled it, and thank God it blossomed out, and I was floating, and the next thing I knew, I hit the ground. How long, I don't know, maybe 15 seconds or something like that, but not very long. So we had been briefed on what to do if you do get shot down, and the idea was you try to contact the underground, which in Austria was present, but not on a high level. And so I ended up in a farmer's barn until it got daylight, and then the farmer was out working in his fields, and I approached him and tried to get across the idea that I was an American and I wanted to get in touch with the underground. It didn't work out. He essentially said, "Stay here and I'll be back," in German. I think that's what he said. He came back in about a half hour with another fellow, and fellow was pushing a bicycle, and he had a pistol on his hip, and I had blood all over my head and all over me. I was a mess, but this fellow motioned to me to take the bicycle and he'd follow me. And I thought, well, this is sort of like they briefed us. It might happen. Maybe this guy is on the right side. And we got near a school, primary school, near a number of little children coming to school, maybe first grade or something like that. And when they got right up to the fellow who was behind me with a gun, they all did Heil Hitler.
Aye.
To the wrong guy. He was the head Nazi in town. So he put me in the local jail, and from there on, I was sent into a holding pattern at a jail in Wels, Austria, and then eventually our navigator and our co-pilot showed up at the same jail, and turned out 4 of us from the crew of 8 had survived, and the other 4 did not. And we were taken to Frankfurt, where they did interrogations in a place called Oberusel. And after interrogations and getting cleaned up and clean uniforms and instructions to behave ourselves and nothing would happen, and we were put on a POW train and sent to Stalag Luft 1, which is on the Baltic Sea coast north of Berlin, about 100 miles. And Stalag Luft 1 was, at the end of the war, there were between 9,000 and 10,000 U.S. Air Force prisoners in this camp. There were a few Royal Air Force and a few Canadian Air Force, but it was an Air Force camp, essentially. And the greeting when we got there and got off the train, we were told, "For you, the war is over. And don't try to escape. If you try to escape and climb the fence, or if you're outside your barracks after dark, you will be shot." So that was our briefing, and that was our last mission. It happened to be our 25th mission. So the law of averages actually worked out. 4% loss per mission. You go on 25 missions, you got 100%. But we were right on the curve. Now, as far as what it was like in prison camp, you all know varying versions of that. We experienced a very cold winter. There were, I think, 24 of us in each room in this barracks. We had very little heat. Once in a while we'd get a few chunks of coal to put in the stove. Each day our food ration was a bowl of dehydrated vegetable soup, a cup of ersatz coffee, and 1/7 of a loaf of black bread. And if we were lucky enough to get some Red Cross food parcels, then that was the best thing that happened. Unfortunately, since we'd been bombing the railroads and the bridges and all the transportation in Germany, their transportation system was really pretty well shot, and they had a lot of trouble getting the Red Cross food parcels to the camp. It wouldn't be unusual, if we did have a lucky day, that we might get 1/4 of a Red Cross parcel per person, or 1/7, or once in a great while, maybe you'd get a whole parcel that was supposed to last you for a week. And I know that you probably all in varying degrees experienced similar things, but I gained a very strong respect for the Red Cross and the way they were working hard to try to get some help to us. We had a radio that had been assembled by some of our predecessors at the camp through bribing the guards, one component at a time. They'd bribe the guards with cigarettes out of their Red Cross parcels or whatever they could use. And so each night this radio was assembled, and while the electricity was still on, they could pick up the broadcast from the BBC. And the BBC always gave reports on the progress of the war and where the lines were and so on. And so we were able to keep track of what was happening in the war. Unfortunately, the Battle of the Bulge was occurring about that time, and things looked pretty bleak for quite some time. But the radio had to be disassembled every night after the broadcast because we had to hide the parts. Excuse me. And we'd have surprise inspections every so often. And if they found a radio, you'd be in really serious trouble. So the Nazis never did find the radio that we had in our barracks. There was one celebrity in our barracks, a fellow named Gabby Gabreski, who was a B-47 pilot who had been shot down about the same time we were. He was the leading ace in the European theater at that time. I think he had 38 planes killed to his credit. And he was an interesting fellow, and after his freedom from the POW camp, he stayed on in the service and became quite a colorful character. He went to work for Grumman Aviation later and had, I think he was given promotion. Eventually, he was probably a brigadier general by the time.
Never made general.
Pardon me?
He never made general.
He didn't make general.
Just a full colonel.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. He was when I knew him in prison camp, he was a very dapper guy. He had a black handlebar mustache and a swagger, and you know, everybody would like to be like Gabreski. One time, many years after that, I was at a meeting in Denver, and our cocktail room was here, and across the hall was a room with a bunch of Air Force retirees. Somebody was talking about Gabby Gabreski, and I thought, I have to go over and find out if he's at that meeting. This is probably at least 20, 25 years after the war was over. So I asked somebody, is Gabby Gabreski going to be here? Yeah, they said, here he comes down the hall right now. Well, my mental picture was black mustache and all this. Here came this old guy, pretty fat, walking like I do. Yeah, I shook hands with him and we reminisced a little bit, but he lost it just like the rest of us did. I think he's gone now. Well, after we were liberated by the Russians, sometime in April of '45, they came in and of course we'd been starving, and they knew that, so they drove in some cattle and hogs and essentially said, help yourselves. And then some of the fellas in the camp had been butchers or knew enough, had lived on farms, knew enough about carving up animals into steaks and so on. So we ate high on the hog every night, and we got sick every morning. We didn't know anything about bland diets. We just ate whatever there was and enjoyed it. The Russians also brought in some entertainment for us. They'd be like USO shows, I guess, and they'd have dancers and singers. And the war was still on. This is before VE Day. And their plan was to have us march, nearly 10,000 POWs, march all the way from Barth down to Odessa on the Black Sea.
Oh, God.
And this would have been a death march for sure, because we were in poor condition, and it sounded like the worst thing that could happen. So our ranking officer, who was Colonel Zemke, who was also a really important fighter pilot. He was an ace several times, I think. he got the Russians to agree to leave us at Stalag Luft 1 where we were until the war was over. And they said, you guys stay out of the way, because if you try and get out of the camp and go get between the lines of the Germans and the Russians and the Americans, you're all going to get shot up again, and you don't need that. And you can't do anything to help the war effort now. So we thought that was good advice, and we waited until VE Day. And shortly after that, the 8th Air Force flew in and evacuated 10,000 of us over a period of a few days back to France, Camp Lucky Strike, where we were given clean clothes again and haircuts and cleaned up. General Eisenhower came to inspect the troops, and we got a huge ovation. And then over time, we were put on Liberty ships and sent back to New Jersey, Camp Shank, I think it was. A lot of you have had that same experience. And then we were able to go home for recuperation leave. The plan was, after maybe 2-month recuperation leave, then we would be headed for Far East to start bombing the Japanese. I must tell you, I wasn't too enthusiastic about that by that time, but that was our job. So it turned out that VJ Day occurred before any of us were turned around and sent on our way to get involved in that scrap. We were sent down to San Antonio, Texas, to be discharged into the Air Force Reserve, or Army Air Corps Reserve, I guess. And there was quite a long wait. I was there about 6 weeks before my turn came up to get discharged. And during that time, I came down with polio. Now that was bad luck, and they tried to figure out where would I have contracted polio, because they thought the incubation period was about 2 weeks. Well, I said, I've been in San Antonio for 6 weeks, and they said, this is the only case of polio in the state of Texas. And we want to know every place you've been.
Oh, God.
So that wasn't too complicated, but they never did figure out where it came from, how I could have had it. Eventually, they kept me in the hospital in San Antonio for several months until I went through the recuperation period and physical therapy, and tried to get me back into working order again. Over time, I was given a 20% disability because of the polio. I ended up with one leg that was not functioning quite right, so I had a built-in limp. But considering what happened to others, I thought I was pretty lucky. I was able to go back to school, get back into engineering again, finished up at Iowa State, and married, had a family, 2 children, boy and a girl, 3 wonderful grandchildren, and my wife passed away early part of last year. We'd been married for 54 years, so
Wow.
I figured I was very fortunate, and just early this year, we had some good family friends, a lady whose husband had been an Air Force officer during World War II. She lost her husband about 4 years ago. And so earlier this year we decided we'd known each other for 20 years. Living alone was not that great. Let's get married and get on with our lives. So we have done that. And
Good.
this Thanksgiving, I feel like I have a lot to be thankful for. I'm thankful I was able to get that ripcord pulled and open the parachute, because without that, none of the rest of this would have happened. After I retired, I worked for 34 years for Fisher Controls Company in Marshalltown, Iowa. And as Frank knows, Iowa winters build character.
Right.
Well, after all that time, I had accumulated more character than I knew how to handle. So that's when we decided to move to San Diego and reminisce about the Iowa winters. So I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for being a member of this organization. And although I haven't been a very faithful attender, I expect and hope to be able to come to more meetings and participate more, get to know more of you. I give my thanks to Frank and the other volunteers that do all the hard work in this organization. And beyond that, I'm thankful to be an American.
Wait, I gotta jump in here. And I spoke last time. And he said he was liberated by the Russians, but I was liberated by the communists. I mean, there's a big fucking difference. Now, when did they release you?
The 1st of May.
'Cause I had bitter experience with them. I mean,
We had a good experience with them, I felt. I would say sometime late April.
yeah, see, I was held until May 20th.
You
They
were a
holding us
problem.
hostages.
We were liberated May 1st.
May 20th.
I was up there.
Where was Luft One?
Right on the wall.
I was released May 20th.
Yeah,
North of Berlin.
100 miles north of Berlin on the Baltic Sea. 100 miles.
Yeah, they were letting them go at first, but then they start tightening
Where
up.
did you take
Because
both
we
of your?
weren't returning their people. So when did they get back to American lines?
10th. Between the 10th and the 15th.
Yes.
The last guys went out on the 15th
Of May or April?
of May.
Yeah.
May. We were liberated, they came in on the last day of April, so we were liberated when we got up May the 1st, sunrise. That's when the flags, the 3 flags, the Russian and the English and the American flag were flying down where the Nazi flag had been flying.
Well, I'm glad for him, but I had nothing to.
Okay.
Where did you take your volunteer training?
Oh, Deming, New Mexico,
Great spot. What class was that?
44-4.
May I add a little bit to your talk?
Sure.
You talking about Colonel Nebraska?